What's up, Egon? We have not done this in a while.
It's been too long, my dude.
Yeah. So, hey guys, we are back for an episode of Text of the Matter. Today we're going to be doing Hegel 3, essentially, and
Essentially,
dialectics
yeah.
4 or 5, if not more, because
We're
it is all.
whatever it is, it's Hegel.
Yeah.
So I hope you have your dialectic all strapped up.
Yeah. Yes. Strapped up with the dialectic. If only people would put down their guns and pick up their dialectics.
Do you think a dialectic gun would shoot both people, or
Yeah, no, shoot both people and then bring them back to life.
yeah, it's part gun that kills both
Yeah,
people
but
as
then
well as
it
yeah.
resolves the conflict between them, and then they transcend and become best friends. It'd
See, Hegel can solve all the
yeah,
problems of the world just like that. No problem.
exactly.
No problem.
But like what we're doing here is we're going back to Hegel for a final time, and at the same time we're going to be talking about many things outside of Hegel. Um,
I know
in
you're
this,
all sighing a sigh of relief right now out
yeah,
there in the YouTube world.
and I think the end is both to say something about Hegel and to say something about why Hegel is both quite essential and has his problems, and that those problems do not make it impossible to read him as one of the most rich thinkers of German idealism, of philosophy, and as one of the reasons why people still do philosophy and why it is an important endeavor, because he is demonstrative of some pretty essential qualities
Hell yeah.
of the practice.
Yeah, and we were kind of talking about this before we started recording, and I think one of the cool things about philosophy, one of the cool things about Hegel is the way that he deals with philosophy is interesting. And I think a lot of the especially contemporary critiques against him come from the process that he does his thinking through, which is, he kind of approaches things with a beginner's mind. And his whole process of dialectical thinking is one where, he's willing to go through the steps. And in order to go through those steps, there's a lot of, I don't want to call them dead ends along the way, but a lot of places that aren't philosophically sound, that aren't um, an end all be all. And specifically, he does this so he can pass through them, so he can critique a very logical or rational thought to find where it's actually irrational, to find where it's actually fails us as the truth, and to move forward from there. And so
Absolutely.
when talking about Hegel, I think it's important to remember this because he's going to pass through a lot of ideas that while you're reading them in a very large book that is very, dense, you can get angry, right? There's points that are frustrating or confusing, but he's always working towards the end of the book or working towards his sort of final thought. And so he's interesting in that way and important because in so doing you really can see how something like World War I and World War II happens, how we go from kind of imperialism to this NATO based sort of state sponsored demagoguery, right?
Yeah.
And through the Marxist wave, through the sort of neo-fascist wave, sort of neoliberalism, it all in some ways is sort of predicted, or at least sort of the foundation is laid through Hegel, right?
Yeah, and it's there's also this curious element where it's interesting to wonder to what extent is the groundwork laid, or to what extent is the tactility and flexibility of his system, that is dialectics, that is not negativity as concepts, do they allow for the sort of kind of revisionist interpretation of them into the present, and therefore kind of revivifying our thoughts
Yeah.
through their power, you know,
And
like
also, like, certain sort of more broader philosophical thoughts, right? Like, obviously, there's a huge connection between what Hegel does and Karl Marx.
yes,
And, as someone like Zizek would argue, there is kind of a re-enlivening of Marx through the interpretation of his work through Hegel. And
yes,
so the kind of study of Hegel is really important in the sense um, that it does re-enliven these ideas and can sort of like shed light on parts that have gone fallow, right?
absolutely. And it's interesting where we start. So I think like starting with Hegel and starting from, to some extent, from where we ended prior, which was we ended with freedom and self-consciousness, and we were getting into some elements of reason with the unhappy consciousness, and these were concepts that were central to what's often called the slave master dialectic, or um, the lord and the bondsman, right? uh, and you see that he is laying down the groundwork of how individual consciousness, the relationship of individual consciousness is, both in the past in a historical feudal context like that of the lord and the bondsman, as well as the sort of difficult consciousness of modernity, um, end up compiling into through senses, through ideas, through the process by which these things become shared meaning,
Right.
um, turn into a collective form of truth making, right? Which is reason, which is this total rationality. Um, Marcuse, for instance, in Reason and Revolution, refers to the total movement of which Hegel was part of as idealist rationality, but I think it most directly sticks to him because in what he is describing, this idea that the human mind, in its process of reasoning out the world, is then coming into constant conflict with the sort of immediacy, the bare immediacy or actuality of reality, and therefore, like in that reflection, bringing that up to the level of ideas which are shared by other people and therefore worked out together, right, means that the truth is all self-contained within this totality of thought. And later he will get into institutions, religious institutions, institution of the family, of culture in general, as being the next step into forming what he calls the absolute, right? And the absolute is being the end of philosophy proper, but also this transformative whole that never can really end at the same time.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, Hegel has this really interesting approach, right? Because, so we did Critique of Pure Reason by Kant, and Hegel is kind of taking these things that Kant has developed, this sort of centralization of subjectivity. Um, but as we talked about with the Kant episode, right? Like, there's a sort of philosophical dead end there, it feels like, where,
Yes.
how can you say anything about truth if everything is subjective? And so, sort of an interesting way to think about what Hegel is doing is he is trying to find the universal in the subjective. And he does this through a lot of different ways, um, but primarily centering the fact that the subjective experience is a universal experience, right? So that
Yes.
when I say here is a tree, we talked about this in the preface episode, you know, that statement is a lie. Here is whatever is in front of you, right? This video, right?
Yes.
Even if I put a tree on the video, like, there's not a tree in front of you, but but these statements hold true because of the universality of the I, that any I can be in my place looking at a tree, and we can all say, yes, there is a tree.
Yeah.
And so, Hegel it's interesting because he's got uh, this system, right? They always call it Hegel's system, and he's trying to
Mhm.
take us from sense certainty through perception on through understanding, through then self certainty or self consciousness, through the truth of reason, and then through bondage into freedom, which he associates with the absolute. And and it's I think Hegel is really fascinating in this because it can get really confusing in how he is constantly trying to shift the subject to a predicate. And through this shift, which is kind of a rudimentary way to talk about dialectics outside of the silly
Thesis,
thesis, antithesis,
antithesis.
synthesis,
Yeah.
right? But through this, Hegel is trying to find a universality in subjectivity, and trying to, as we see, he will center the nation as this expression, right, of this sort of universal subject.
Well, he does so by going through various elements that he sees as both constitutive and as
Mm-hmm.
failing to grasp that universality, right? Because as you mentioned before, he combines the particular and the universal as being sort of reciprocally linked and as being one and the same, two sides of the same coin, right? But only they're only realized in the other through, let's say, through a complex process of inversion, synthesis, and then transcendence, right? Or sort of an immanent movement, immanent as in coming from within
Mm-hmm.
and becoming something greater than the internal thing was outside of itself. So, for instance, we can talk about the family, which is to me, one of the most fascinating parts of the book, right? Because in it, he's trying to confront the divine law. He's trying to confront the way in which the kind of spiritual thinking has meaning within the totality of knowledge. Because clearly it isn't the same thing as empirical knowledge. It isn't the same thing as science, right? But
Right.
it obviously has this, and especially at his own time, this monumental force on knowledge, on the way that people reason, on the totality of how culture is formed. And so he begins it by sort of outlining how the community, as being this kind of basic unit of uh, moral determination and ordering of the community, uh, is centered in the family unit, and the family unit as in a male father, a female mother, a female daughter, a male son, right? As this unit of four, the typical what is it? What do they
No, you
use
got
the
it.
phrase,
Nuclear
Matt?
family. Yeah.
Nuclear family, right,
Yeah.
Matt? Yeah, we have Matt off. He's saying yes. You're right, Michael. You got it.
The
And I'm
producer
so
says it's right. It's got to be right.
I'm so proud. I'm so proud of myself. Hey, Matt, say hey.
Hey, what's up, y'all?
Yeah, say Matt's been here the whole time. Yeah, but so I think there's I connect two interesting quotes for me. One comes directly from Hegel, from Spirit as the larger section, but this coming from immediately prior to his section on the ethical order, which goes into human and divine knowledge, which we were just talking about before. At the end of it, in section 463, he says, the one extreme, the universal self-conscious spirit, becomes, through the individuality of man united with its other extreme, its form and element, with unconscious spirit. On the other hand, the divine law has its individualization, or the unconscious spirit of the individual, its real existence. And in the woman, through whom, as its middle term, the unconscious spirit rises out of its reality into actual existence, out of a state into which it is unknowing and unconscious into the realm of conscious spirit, right? So in this way, there is this sort of unconscious, substantial element of spirit itself that is only realized synthetically and negatively through the woman, that through the particular woman passed from mother to daughter, then daughter to participation within a marriage and within a community, sort of renders this unconscious element conscious to the totality, right, through their sort of natural divinity. This is both problematic, but it is like conceptually powerful, right? Like, what is it if we abstract what femininity means and throw away Hegel's strict idea that it would be a cis woman, right? And instead take femininity to be a detached and freer category, with more like substantial meaning than he even suggests in it, then all of a sudden divinity has new substance that we can look at, right? The way in which the unconscious, that which cannot be realized through human law and through human order, like is suddenly becomes something that's far more complex and far more interesting in the way that it interacts with categories. Now, you can say again in an affirmative way that, okay, this limits these ideas, because what about the masculine divide? But for instance, here's a quote from Zizek that I think relates very interestingly. And he's applying these ideas to Lacan, but Hegel is always in the background. So perhaps the incompatibility between Derrida and Deleuze can also be accounted for in terms of Lacan's formula of sexuation. What makes Derrida masculine is the persistence throughout his work of totalization, with exception, the search for a post-metaphysical way of thinking, for an escape from metaphysical closure, presupposes the violent gesture of universalization, of a leveling, equalization, unification of the whole field of intermetaphysical struggles. All attempts to break out of metaphysics, from Kierkegaard to Marx, from Nietzsche to Heidegger, from Levinas to Levi-Strauss, ultimately remain within the horizon of the metaphysics of presence, as Derrida says. The same gesture is clearly discernible in Heidegger, for whom all reversals of metaphysics, from Marx to Nietzsche, from Husserl to Sartre, remain within the horizon of the forgetting of being, ultimately caught in the technological nihilism of the accomplishment of metaphysics, as well as in Adorno and Horkheimer, for whom all Western, and not only Western thought, is totalized, equalized as the gradual deployment of the dialectic of enlightenment, which culminates in today's administered world, from Plato to NATO, as one used to say. In Derrida, the logic of totalizing exception finds its highest expression in the formula of justice as the indeconstructible condition of deconstruction. Everything can be deconstructed, with the exception of the indeconstructible condition of deconstruction itself. Perhaps it is this very gesture of violent equalization of the entire field against which one's position as exception is then formulated, which is the most elementary gesture of metaphysics. In clear contrast to Derrida, this gesture of violent equalization is absent from Deleuze's work. His gaze upon the tradition of philosophy is something like the gaze of God upon creation in God's reply to Job, as described by Chesterton. There is no norm which would allow us to level the field. Miracles are everywhere. Every phenomenon perceived properly from a position which estranges it from its standard context is an exception. That is why what both Deleuze and Badiou call the minimal difference is not the gesture of totalizing the enemy performed by critics of metaphysics from Heidegger to Adorno and Derrida, but its opposite, a de-totalization of the enemy. Yeah, that's a long quote and it's complex, but what he's getting at there is that the masculine, in a Hegelian sense and also in a Lacanian sense, who is taking from Hegel, is this totalizing force, is this attempt to make concrete and make whole, make absolute. And then at the same time, the feminine, which is realized in Deleuze, a man, is to suspend this in a sort of mystical indifference and love, right? And to take in everything as a possibility, as a potential, as a transformation, as a mirror, copy, simulacra. And that suddenly changes the dialectic, right? It no longer is constrained to its patriarchal system, the patriarchal system that seems to define it. It gains new valences. And that's one of the great powers of the Hegelian dialectic. But the Hegelian dialectic, as it has transitioned through time and through other people's thoughts, which is predicated by the dialectic itself.
Well, and I think given this section that we're speaking to on the divine law versus human law, which Hegel is sort of dividing as we're talking about between the woman and the man, between masculinity and femininity, is that, I think one of Hegel's biggest contributions to the world is his belief that the dialectic is an action, that in all of his thinkings, he is centering action as vital to the change of everything. He's always fighting against stasis. He's always fighting against what he calls analyzing dead things, right? Like cutting up and classifying something into its constituent parts, which to Hegel are dead. And so he's very interested in I don't want to say the mechanics because he's not looking at things in a Newtonian sense, but in a dynamic sense. And so of course, Hegel is coming from some pretty piss poor gender dynamics, writing in the 17th century as he was, and in a Prussian society that was extremely patriarchal, extremely heteronormative, of course. But I think we have to look at what he's actually speaking to. And in this section in Phenomenology of the Spirit, what he's speaking to is what are the actions of these two roles in society, right? You have the
Absolutely.
feminine, you have the woman who is, right, childbearer, birth giver, life maker. And in that role, in that action, right, her connection to society, um, to the world is this. It has legacy. It's long term. It's universal, right? Um,
Absolutely.
he calls her the kind of the ruler of the netherworld, and that her interest, her activity inside of the family is one that has to answer to both her progeny but also to her predecessors, in
Yes.
that our ancestors in many ways speak through her. And in a kind of surprising turn, Hegel actually calls women the head of the family,
Hmm.
despite it being like this
Absolutely.
patriarchal system. And the reason for that is, okay, well, let's look at what is the man doing, and particularly in this journey, right, from son to then a man to assuming husband, right? What happens is, as the boy grows into a man, at a certain point, he must leave the family. He must go
Yes.
out. He must make his own, right? Which is super important to Hegel. He's all about this world creation as sort of a pinpoint and main point of his theory. And
And
so
just
what
very quickly from the individual to the collective. But yes.
Right. And I'm glad you mentioned that, because this is one of the interesting things about this dichotomy. And on first blush, he's putting the woman in this, or the female, or however you want to refer to it, the mother, in this very universal role.
Yes.
And man is going out in this very subjective individual role. Like he has to go
Yes.
out on his own, make his own way, find his own job, his own wife, etc., make his own household, right?
And in a sense construct a falsehood, construct this negativity of what is existing in the real, in actuality, unconsciously in the mother. But
Right.
go on.
And as he refers to it as a citizen, essentially, right? As a citizen, as a subjective person who must meet other subjective people in society on equal terms, this is where we get government from, right? This is where we get communal action, or as he calls it, human law. And you can see it in this kind of reversal where all of a sudden the individual has to take on the task of the universal. And in the same breath, what happens to the, I'll say, the matriarchal side of the family is in government becomes the individual, and where he critiques government in that, where our representatives, right, or in his day, the sort of fine houses are supposed to be ruling with the thought of the common good in mind, gets hijacked by the interests of the family through the woman. And
Yes.
this is sort of where he gets really misogynistic if you're reading along in the
Hmm.
book. But uh, if you can remove your critique of that for a moment and look at what he's setting up, he's setting up in the relationship, in the dialectical relationship between the family and society, in these like two main forms of what community is, this fight, this struggle between representing the universal interests through our kind of subjective roles in the world. And
Absolutely.
and this of course leads to Hegel's focus and obsession with the nation state, which I think we should probably
Certainly.
discuss.
Now I will say before that, one thing that I think needs to be like entirely clarified, and I'm going to go to a little bit of Hegel from another book,
Okay.
which is here translated as Science of Logic, translated by A.V. Miller, which is entirely metaphysical, whereas this is leading towards spirit, and this, as in phenomenology of spirit, is leading towards his construction of the absolute, as in this thing that contains all of humanity. The Science of Logic is more about the dialectic itself in its nitty-gritty details. And
Yeah,
so
I don't want to
again,
call it epistemological, but it is in some way. It's
yes,
more Kant than, or
it's
more of what.
entirely conceptual,
Yes,
you
yeah, there we
know.
go. Yeah,
And while the concepts are, they have practical use, and they are referring to practical objects, like there isn't the same idea of he's describing society in itself, or what society should be, or how society works. There aren't a lot of ought statements in Hegel. It's sort of presumed that this is what is. But for instance, relatively early in Science of Logic, in this section, Being for Self, he writes about the one and the void. And
mm-hmm,
he says,
mm-hmm.
the one is the void as the abstract relation of the negation to itself. However, the void as the nothing is absolutely distinct from the simple immediacy, the also affirmative being of the one. And since they stand in one and the same relation, namely that of the one, their difference is posited, but as distinct from the affirmative being of the one, and nothing as the void is outside it. Being for self, determined in this manner as the one and the void, has again acquired a determinate being, right? It moves from this abstraction that was inside of it, the being as stated, your oneness as stated as being nothing at all, and that nothing then becoming this void outside of you, now
Right.
is determined as a thing, right?
Well,
The
right,
one,
and if I can cut you off just briefly, I
yeah,
mean, in this specific book, one of his major goals, if you will, is, Hegel knows that mathematics has its place, it has its use function, but is really trying to place philosophy above mathematics because mathematics is something that's devoid of content. And for
yes.
Hegel, you can't separate essence and substance. And in kind of reinventing logic, he's reinventing it in a way that uh, you can't have form without content.
And you can also sustain contradictory statements, contradictory forms, contradictory contents simultaneously, right? And they can still retain meaning and then resolve themselves into new meaning, into transcended meaning. And like if we go through to a little bit more to the end, right? So being for self determined in this manner as the one and the void has acquired a determinate being, the one and the void have negative relation to self for their common simple base, right? The self is the core of the one and the void. The moments of being for self emerge from this unity, become external to themselves. So moments of nothingness and oneness are a series that combine into the self. Through the simple unity of these moments, there enters a determination of being, and the unity thus reduces itself to being only one side, and so to a determinate being. And in this is confronted by its other determination, the negation as such, right? That which is saying that it is not the self, that which is the other, that which is the nothing, that
Mm-hmm.
which is the outside, and that likewise as a determinate being of the nothing as the void, right? And so this is highly abstract, but if you listen to these plays of words, right, you come to see what is happening at an abstract level over these relations between father and wife, son and daughter, divine and human law, individual and the community, the priest and the abstract mother of of divine law. Like in this way, it becomes easier to understand the slight deviations of belief,
Right.
right? Which are ultimately not so important. They're important in a historical sense, of course, if we're going to be materialist, but they aren't so important in like absolutely defining the conceptual content. And so when we talk about the state, right, as the result of this whole process, what he defines the state as and the way through which he realizes the state are two different things and have two different ends. And then they're also connected things that we have to kind of tease out how the process has produced the actual assumptions, beliefs, and arguments.
Yeah, and I mean, and it's important to understand his use of negativity, of negation, right? I think this is one of the fundamental things that gets talked about a lot regarding Hegel and regarding the dialectic, but isn't necessarily expounded upon in a way that makes it a usable concept. And, all he's arguing is that, you know, the subject itself is a negation, right? We have negated all of the possible world to be this little meat puppet with our little Geist inside of us.
Yes,
And so when Hegel goes on and on about negation, this is what he's talking about. Not only are, through holding inherently contradictory terms about ourselves, um, and through making those be able to play nice to one another, to be something that can be that these two contradictory things can be the same thing, we negate sort of wrong ways of thinking. But we also further define, and definition is another way of looking at negation, right? And if you are
absolutely.
defining what a tiger is, well, what are you doing? Really, what you're saying, well, it's not a tree, it's not a lion, it's not a goat, it's not a tabby cat. Um, and so he's fundamentally kind of flipping, I think, philosophy on its head in this way, because normally it's, whether it's philosophy or the sciences, it's looked at this as this affirmative process. I'm
Yes.
affirming that this is a tiger. But in much of what Hegel does, he goes, well, no, that's not right. You are negating the universe to say that this is a tiger. And that, and then of course this is where, the meat and potatoes of Hegel really comes in, because in that sentence, right, in, oh, this is a tiger, well, we're speaking about an individual tiger. So what makes the individual tiger the same as every other tiger that are all very different from one another? And and again, you had this phrase earlier, you kind of called that quote you were reading wordplay.
Yeah.
And I think that's what, like, Hegel is the master of, is he's like the master of wordplay, where he's like always, if you read Hegel with a sense of joy or wonder, like, what's fun about it is it's he uses the logic of language to refute basic concepts at every turn that he can.
Well, that's what I was going to respond to. What you were saying was that that is the beauty of Hegel, and in every point in which over the 20th century Anglophone philosophy, positivist philosophy, tried to deny Hegel and deny various European forms of philosophy that were spawned from Kant and Hegel because of their use of language, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because they didn't follow the law of non-contradiction. What is important to grasp here is that while negativity does define something that is concrete, it also defines something that is lively and abstract and meaningful in a different way, and is, I believe, found predominantly in language, in the way that there is no solving language, as like Wittgenstein discovered when he realized that the Tractatus was not the perfect representation of language, but rather a bit of poetry,
Yeah. Yeah.
and that even though I don't think he ultimately solved it with his language games, he got closer to accepting negativity. And so when we say negativity, you can think about it in a highly conceptual way. You can also think of it in a very concrete way, in the way that we both deny that which is external to us as subjects, but also the way in which we construct languages and say what is and what is not, and that we require that what is not for meaning to be. If
Mm-hmm.
everything was, what is, then there would be massive gaps in the way that we form meaning. And this is a essential mechanism to the dialectic.
Well, right. I mean, just to use the sort of divine and human law we were talking about, the sort of um, male female dialectic, right? If you look at the boy who then grows up and has to go out on his own and be this very individualist person, who then becomes an old man, right? Who maybe has more of a shepherd's role to play in society, where maybe through a life lived is trying to impart um, laws or advice that fits his role as someone who's been a brash young individual, but has learned the importance of community and of communalism. And I bring this up to say is that there is that personal negation too, right? There is the I was a child and now I am
Yes.
adult, and one day I will negate my adultness by being an old man. But at the same time, internalizing that whole process the whole time.
And I was a male who believed that I could produce human law, and then I actually became a participant in the creation of human law. And that, and if we realize that sort of masculine element, what has been defined as classically masculine, is actually available to all and should be available to all.
Yeah. Well, and I
It
wonder
becomes this
too,
more like creative possibility.
and this is just pure speculation, but I often wonder what Hegel's response, if he were like plopped into today, to um, just different things like non-binary genders or
Yes.
gender augmentation and things like this. Because I think to some extent he would really embrace it,
Yeah, it
surprisingly.
would seem so natural to his sense of identity that
Right.
there would be these splits, deviations, mutations, constant evolution of identity, right? Like in a sense, it is both extremely continuous with him in the most positive way and continuous with him in the negative way, in that, like, where Deleuze would say that maybe we have an obsession with identity that has gotten somewhat mutated by capital in a way that we didn't expect. But I certainly agree that, like, what Hegel would see in this is natural complexity,
Right.
natural movement of the substance of
Yeah, and if you want to think about it in a more historical phenomenon too, right? Like the rise of feminism in the 20th century and
yes,
of suffrage, which is something that Hegel throughout his entire life, even when he starts to get weird and trying to defend monarchy at the end of his life and such, something that he fundamentally believed is universal suffrage. And I think that, like if you want to look at the rise of, the of feminism as a feature in thought, I mean, I think to him it would make a lot of sense, especially when you're looking at a more atomized society, that it's a necessity for women to be able to have that autonomy, to have that rational freedom that he's bequeathing to men in this book, as a matter of due course.
yes, it would be a matter of due course, a matter of, like, the natural process of conflict. Simultaneously, I believe that he would also be critical of the idea that this ideology, that this belief system would hypostasize itself as a form of thought, of which someone would identify themselves for life, right?
Yeah.
And that it would come to represent a social order that would be infinite. Now, this is where we get into the kind of Marxian question of the state, right? Where his ends in this abstraction of the absolute. For Marx, the problem through which women would be struggling, one of their own class, right, has real material concern. So whereas Hegel might say, well, to say that you are a feminist, right, as a woman is somewhat one-sided, right? Once you have gone through this kind of abstract process of equalization with men, you should be taking on, in an abstract sense, the concept of masculinity, right? But when you talk about the Marxian question of class, right, it's not so much whether the women are women or men or believe themselves feminine or masculine that determines their demand for suffrage, but the material concerns of their social reality. If they are suffering, if they have economic access, if they are alienated in their labor or even allowed to have their labor exploited, right?
Right.
Like, these elements produce it. And these are the differences between what would be Hegel's state, which was an important concept for its time, and then Marx's conception of states, government, and eventually socialism as a more total political project.
Yeah, and I think there's a very obvious through point to see how Marx comes from Hegel's ideas, especially given Hegel's insistence on a powerful state being necessary in this world that is constantly alienating itself, right? So, um, for Hegel, Hegel is where we find the sort of origination of this idea of alienation, and it's different. It's much different than it is in the Marxian sense, but it as to use a Hegelian term, the Marxist sense is kind of imminent in his idea of alienation. And towards the end of Phenomenology of Spirit, there's a section on culture called the self-alienated spirit, which he calls culture.
Yes.
Um, and the
And
reason, well, I'm
oh,
sorry.
sorry, go on. No,
Oh,
go
I was
on.
just going to say that the reason that he brings this up is essentially the way that he's looking at it is that through culture, um, the object of our thought is still empty, and there's a kind of doubling that happens, right? That, as he says in section 486, the spirit constructs for itself not merely a world, right? Because the idea of this German idealism is that through the subject we are actually world creators. So he says the spirit constructs for itself not merely a world, but a world that is double, divided and self-opposed. And for Hegel, there's this idea that in making the subject universal, there must be a strong state to keep the subject from acting solely on individualistic wants and desires.
Absolutely. It had
And
that universalization has to take concrete form.
right,
But but in a way, when you go back to Kant and his ideas, which suggested a universal government, right? Universal governance in a sort of Napoleonic way, with predictive or participating in that sort of conception of like a international liberalism. Hegel seems to limit these things to and culture to something that is geographically limited, right? That's socially limited, and that's limited by practice, right? And I think the absolute extends beyond that, right? In the way that
yeah,
the
it's very
state
easy
isn't
to
the limit.
read how that would go beyond. But for Hegel, it's like it seems like language is this stopping point for him that he can't
Exactly. That he
get
can't.
get beyond where well clearly the universalization of a people is the nation state, because how could that expand beyond the language you speak, and that's somehow
Exactly.
this
Exactly.
container, right?
And again, when you see later like a figure like Benjamin, a dialectical materialist, uh, tackling translation, it's sort of an inversion of that problem. It's instead of limiting it to the idea that we cannot get past our language and this determines the limit of how we are going to organize society, it is instead how the concept is transformed in that process of translation from language to language, and how that enriches and also complicates our ability to communicate within an industrial society, and the work by which we participate in the universalization of thought, concepts of a material society, in the making of books, in the
Right.
translation of a film, and the access of all of these new substantial materials. And I think, we were talking about this earlier. I really think it's quite interesting to think of all of these people who I think both of us are confronting: Marcuse, Adorno, Benjamin, and Horkheimer, from the Frankfurt School, Zizek, and the other Slovenes that are currently really attacking dialectical materialism. Thinkers like Lukacs, French thinkers like Kojève or Lefebvre, who all have these very complex ideas and mixtures of Hegel and Marx, but are all very different, right?
Well, and I
And
think, oh, sorry.
oh yeah, and I just simply was going to bring up like one specific articulation of this, which is coming from Lukács, who's writing in the 1920s, right? Um, he says, uh, he says, but Hegel's position today is the reverse of Marx's own. The problem with Marx is precisely to take his method and his system as we find them, and to demonstrate that they form a coherent unity that must be preserved. The opposite is true of Hegel. The task he imposes is to separate out from the complex web of ideas, with its sometimes glaring contradictions, all the seminal elements of his thought, and rescue them as a vital intellectual force for the present. He is a more profitable and potent thinker than many people imagine. And as I see it, the more vigorously we set about the task of confronting this issue, the more clearly we will discern his fecundity and his power as a thinker, right? And this is quite interesting because he's at the height of German socialism, at the height of
Right.
the Russian Revolution.
Yeah, before the fascists take over Germany. But I mean, for me it makes sense because as much as I hate this part of Hegel, because I'm like a little anarchist. I like find a lot of our source of oppression, both spiritually as well as materially, comes from the state, comes from bureaucracy, comes from administration. But what you have happening, especially when Lukacs is writing this, with the death of Lenin, the ascendancy of Stalin,
Absolutely.
and you have the Soviets. Uh, Originally, they want to plow through Poland, get a socialist republic in Germany. They get stopped in Poland. They decide to stop, and what does the USSR do? It becomes the state that Hegel always wanted, with a big brother
Absolutely.
that's policing all your actions and making sure that you are working only for the collective good and not for the individualist good. And
And
in
that
some way,
your individuality is defined by this identification of like these conceptual abstractions that are both concrete, and that Lenin as a political figure existed, but he's also dead and transformed into this image that is constantly looking over everyone and forced into their process of thought, their process of reflection. Like, there's so many elements that you can see in the Stalinist state, both the positives that are ignored and the negatives that are quite apparent,
yeah.
that are indicative of Hegel's thought.
So we're reaching that witching hour, and we don't want to. This isn't a college course, so I think we're going to cut it off here. And you can digest all the good Hegelian gooey goodness. And we're going to kick it off next week with looking more in the relationship between Hegel and Karl Marx, and the kind of ideological communication that the two had, and how Marx was influenced by the dialectic.
On Hegel's Great Baking Show, episode 6.
Oh, beautiful. So hit up that Patreon. We got stickies. And we post occasional content there, like PDFs, things like that. Hit us up Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, whatever you want. And we'll see you next time.
Thank you guys. Bye.